Claire Morrison vanished on a rainy October evening, and within days, a trusted retired police officer named Kenneth Dale and a reclusive handyman named Ronald Greaves were exposed as the architects of a horrifying underground operation that had gone unnoticed for over a decade. On a rainy October evening in 2017, Claire Morrison finished her shift at Blossom & Vine, a cozy floral shop nestled in the center of Brookfield, Oregon. The town was small, the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and everyone knew everyone else by name. Claire had worked at the shop for nearly 4 years and was known for her bright smile, her quiet nature, and her love of arranging wildflowers. That night, she closed the shop at 5:30 p.m., waved goodbye to her manager, and walked out into the grey drizzle with her umbrella in hand. She had plans to meet her sister Jenna for dinner at a local diner just a few blocks away, but she never made it there. When Jenna didn't see Claire by 6 o'clock, she called her phone. It rang twice and then went to voicemail. At first she thought Claire might have gotten caught in traffic or changed her mind about dinner, but after 2 more unanswered calls and no texts, Jenna began to feel uneasy. It wasn't like Claire to disappear or ignore messages. By 8:00, Jenna was driving around town looking for her. She checked Claire's apartment. Empty. She called the floral shop. Closed. She called the police by 10s, officially reporting Claire as missing. The next morning, just before dawn, a local delivery driver spotted Claire's car in a ditch, off Mill Creek Road, a narrow wooded stretch rarely used after dark. The driver thought it looked out of place and called it in. When officers arrived, they found the car unlocked, the keys still in the ignition, and Claire's purse and phone sitting on the passenger seat. There were no broken windows, no obvious signs of a struggle, just mud and rain pooling around the tires. What struck investigators as strange was the driver's side door being slightly ajar, and the windshield wipers still on, even though the battery had since died. Footprints were found near the car, leading away into the woods. They were deep and erratic, like someone had been running or stumbling. But the rain had begun falling steadily the night before, washing away any real definition. Still, the direction was clear. Toward the old mill a half-mile up the road, long since abandoned and rumored to be unsafe. Despite an initial response from police, the search didn't pick up real urgency until Claire had been missing for over 24 hours. Authorities suggested it might be a case of a woman choosing to disappear, possibly overwhelmed by stress. But Claire's friends and family dismissed that immediately. She had no reason to run, no debts, no substance issues, no secrets anyone knew about. Claire was reliable to a fault. She had even left her cat, Mocha, without food or water, something completely out of character. The case gained local media attention quickly. Flyers were posted. Volunteers organized search parties. Drones flew over the forested area near the mill, while cadaver dogs were brought in to sniff along the creek bed. But for days, nothing new turned up. No new tracks. No signs of clothing, no blood, no body. Claire had simply vanished into the rain. 2 weeks after Claire Morrison's disappearance, the search had begun to lose momentum. Local authorities were running out of leads, and community volunteers had grown tired, their optimism fading. The flyers that once felt urgent now hung, limp in the wet wind, corners curling, colors fading. The dense forest surrounding the old mill had been combed over again and again, yet no substantial evidence had turned up. Many began to fear the worst, but without a body there was little the police could confirm. The case remained officially open, but in practice it had begun to stall until a hunter named Greg Elson made a chilling discovery. On a cold Sunday morning, Greg ventured into the woods near the mill with his dog. He often hunted small game in the area and knew the terrain well. As he followed a deer trail that ran behind the mill, something unusual caught his eye, a patch of fabric peeking out from under a pile of damp leaves. It was dark green, torn, and stained. When he pulled it free, he realized it was a jacket, Claire's jacket. Her family later confirmed it from photos. There was even a small stitched daisy near the cuff, something she'd added herself. The police were immediately called. A larger team was dispatched to secure the area. Within hours, they found more disturbing evidence. Just a few feet from where the jacket had been discovered, they noticed that the ground had been deliberately disturbed. Beneath a layer of rocks and thick brush, they uncovered the rotting wooden door of an old storm shelter. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but the inside told a very different story. The air was stale and damp as investigators climbed down into the shelter. The narrow concrete room smelled of mildew, rust, and something else, something far worse. Inside, the walls were covered in grime, but one section had been scrawled over with words. Names, numbers, and strange phrases had been carved deep into the wood with what looked like a screwdriver or knife. There were chains mounted to the wall, rusted but recently disturbed. On the ground lay broken tools, burnt-out candles, and torn pieces of clothing. Some belonged to Claire, others did not. Bloodstains were found on the floor and walls. Some were old, dried, and flaking. Others looked fresher, less than a few weeks old. Forensic teams collected samples and sent them to the lab. What they found shocked everyone. Not only did one of the blood samples match Claire's DNA, but others belonged to at least 3 different individuals, none of whom matched any open missing persons cases in the local system. It was as if the shelter had been used before, maybe many times, and no one had ever noticed. The discovery changed the entire course of the investigation. What began as a missing persons case had just turned into something far darker. This wasn't just about Claire anymore. The old shelter had been a hidden prison, possibly a tomb. The man responsible had chosen the location carefully. Remote, forgotten, quiet. Whoever had done this hadn't just taken Claire, they had planned it. As forensic teams worked to analyze the evidence found in the hidden storm shelter, investigators shifted their focus toward identifying a pattern. The discovery of multiple DNA profiles that didn't match Claire Morrison pointed to a terrifying possibility. This shelter had been used before, potentially as a recurring site for abductions and violent acts. Detectives began combing through old case files from surrounding towns, looking for similarities. Young women who had vanished without explanation, preferably near rural areas or abandoned buildings. Over the next few days, a troubling pattern began to emerge. In a span of nearly 10 years, at least 6 other women had gone missing from nearby towns, each case with disturbingly similar circumstances. All were in their 20s or early 30s. Most had been walking alone or driving late at night, and none were ever found. Several had vanished near wooded areas or near old unused properties. One had even been last seen walking her dog close to the same stretch of road where Claire's car was discovered. At the time, none of these cases were connected. Some were assumed to be voluntary disappearances. Others remained open but inactive due to lack of leads. Now, with new evidence, investigators believed they might have a serial predator. It was around this time that a name began to surface repeatedly in old property records and maintenance logs: Ronald Greaves. He had worked as a contractor and maintenance worker for multiple mills and industrial sites across Oregon, including the one that had long since decayed near Mill Creek Road. He had never been arrested, had no known criminal record, and kept a low profile, moving from town to town every few years. His employment history was erratic, full of short stints and terminations with vague explanations. When investigators cross-referenced his work history with the timeline of disappearances, the correlation was chilling. He had been employed near or around nearly every location where a woman had vanished. Police obtained a warrant to search Ronald's residence, a small isolated home on the outskirts of town surrounded by overgrown brush and rusting tools. Inside, the scene was unsettling. The home was cluttered and dim, filled with strange handwritten notes, maps marked with red circles, and shelves of labeled boxes. Inside those boxes were deeply personal items: earrings, scarves, photographs, shoes, items clearly belonging to women. Among them, authorities found Claire's locket, something her family had desperately hoped she still had on her when she disappeared. It confirmed that Ronald had been in contact with her, likely the last person to see her alive. Even more disturbing was a hidden compartment in his basement. Behind a false wall was a small room lined with old photographs, most of them candid shots of women taken from a distance. Some were smiling. Others looked entirely unaware they were being watched. These were trophies, collected moments before, each woman vanished. Ronald Greaves, once just a name in the background, had now become the prime suspect in what was shaping up to be a long-running and highly organized string of abductions. But what investigators didn't yet realize was that Ronald hadn't acted alone. With Ronald Greaves in custody, the pieces of the mystery began to come together. But the horror was only just unfolding. Ronald initially refused to speak during interrogation, sitting silently, expressionless, even when confronted with photographs of the shelter and the belongings recovered from his home. After 2 days in holding, he finally agreed to a voluntary statement. What he provided was fragmented and disturbing. He claimed that Claire had died before he could release her, a vague statement that made little sense to investigators at first. But when the autopsy results came in, they told a much clearer and far more gruesome story. Claire Morrison had suffered extensive internal injuries, primarily caused by blunt force trauma. Her wrists and ankles showed deep ligature marks, indicating she had been restrained for an extended period. Bruising patterns and damage to her hands suggested she had fought back fiercely. The medical examiner concluded that Claire had remained alive for nearly 4 hours after her final phone ping at the mill. During that window, she had been systematically tortured, physically and psychologically, before succumbing to her injuries. The storm shelter, once thought to be merely a holding place, had been used for much more. The blood on the walls, the crude restraints, the markings carved into the wood, it all painted a picture of ritualistic abuse. Investigators found a journal among Ronald's belongings, filled with twisted philosophies and detailed records. He referred to his actions as corrections, believing he was punishing women for supposed moral failings. Each entry documented a different victim, marked by date and coded initials. Claire's name appeared on the last page. Her entry was longer than any other. But what investigators didn't expect was a second voice, an accidental trace of someone else. While reviewing audio tapes found in Ronald's basement, detectives picked up faint background noise. These tapes were meant for Ronald's personal documentation, narrated accounts of his so-called corrections. In several of them, a second male voice could be heard, sometimes laughing, sometimes giving instructions. It was muffled, low, but unmistakably present. Voice recognition software identified the second voice as belonging to Kenneth Dale, a former police officer who had served in the Brookfield area for over 20 years. He had retired only a few years prior and was widely respected in the community. At first glance, there was no apparent link between him and Ronald, but further digging revealed they had known each other for decades. They had grown up in neighboring towns, and both had worked briefly at the same lumberyard in their early 20s. Ronald had even listed Kenneth as an emergency contact on an old job application. Kenneth's presence on the tapes shifted the investigation in a new direction. The team now believed that Ronald hadn't been working alone. There was a system, someone helping to cover up the crimes, redirect suspicion, and silence complaints. Ronald had been the executioner, but someone else had been pulling strings from within the very institutions meant to protect people. The true depth of the conspiracy was about to surface, and the name Kenneth Dale was just the beginning. The revelation that Kenneth Dale, a retired police officer, had been involved in the series of abductions and murders sent shockwaves through the community. He had been a trusted figure, a man who had once stood in front of classrooms to teach children about safety, who had attended neighborhood barbecues, and who was remembered by many as a kind and dependable public servant. The idea that he had played a central role in covering up, facilitating, and possibly even participating in the torture and killing of women shattered the town's sense of trust and security. Investigators moved quickly. With the audio tapes and Ronald's coded journals as supporting evidence, a warrant was issued for Kenneth's arrest. His home was searched top to bottom. There, authorities discovered what they had feared: meticulous files kept on various women, including surveillance photos, notes on their routines, and even police reports that had somehow never been submitted into the official system. These were not random victims. They were selected carefully, tracked for weeks or even months. Kenneth had used his access as an officer to find vulnerabilities, exploiting the system to ensure no one would ask the right questions when these women went missing. One room in Kenneth's basement had been converted into what resembled a personal archive. Dozens of folders lined the shelves, each labeled with initials. Inside were stolen ID cards, personal belongings, and even interview transcripts from victims' families that Kenneth had secretly recorded. In one chilling folder labeled CM, investigators found Claire Morrison's high school yearbook photo, a receipt from the floral shop dated 2 weeks before her disappearance, and a map of the Mill Creek area marked with several red X's. Kenneth was arrested without incident. In interviews, he maintained a calm demeanor, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. He denied ever hurting anyone, claiming the tapes had been manipulated and the evidence planted, but a deeper forensic analysis left no room for doubt. His fingerprints were on the journal, his voice matched the recordings, and DNA evidence found on one of the restraints in the shelter matched his profile. His denial crumbled as more victims were linked to both him and Ronald. When the trial began, it drew national attention. For weeks, courtroom testimony revealed the depth of the depravity and the chilling level of coordination between Ronald and Kenneth. Witnesses described Kenneth's role in downplaying missing persons reports, misfiling evidence, and discouraging families from pushing investigations forward. It became clear that the two men had operated as a unit, Ronald as the predator and Kenneth as the protector, ensuring no one ever connected the dots. Kenneth Dale was found guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with evidence, abuse of power, and direct involvement in the torture and deaths of at least 4 women, including Claire. He was sentenced to 9 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Ronald, who had been awaiting trial, died by suicide in his jail cell just days before jury selection. Claire's tragic story brought long overdue justice, not only for herself, but for the other forgotten women whose names were buried in closed files and unsolved cases. Her final hours revealed a conspiracy that had thrived in silence for years. In the end, she exposed the rot hiding behind the badge and ensured that no other woman would vanish unnoticed in Brookfield again.